Hi, thank you for staying tuned to this topic on why electricity in Kenya is expensive. This is the second part of this topic where we'll see how the power purchase agreements between KPLC and the independent power producers contributes to the high cost of electricity in Kenya. My name is Susan Wanjiko. I'm the founder of wanjikuseyeke, and here I discuss the relationship between economic development and governance so that you can understand, engage, and influence the matters that affect you and I. Welcome to wanjikuseyeke. Now, in my previous video, I briefly mentioned the IPPs and the power purchase agreements. So let's understand what these power purchase agreements are, also known as PPAs. So PPAs are very high-level tenders given to private investors to generate electricity on behalf of a government, which then supplies that power to its citizens through a utility company, now like KPLC. The investment normally costs an amount in the millions of dollars, and it's a long-term contract because setting up a power plant also doesn't take a short time. So mark these words, the concern for the private investor is not whether there is demand for electricity in that country, but instead whether the government or utility company will be in a position to pay the private investor for that project. So any demand risks, meaning if they produce energy and the country doesn't need it, that risk is shouldered by the off-taker, which in this case is KPLC, the utility company. So what's the justification for IPPs? For governments, contracting independent power producers to generate electricity on their behalf is sometimes a more favorable option for several reasons. First, these projects cost a lot of money in the millions of dollars, so they're extremely capital intensive. So governments would rather place that burden on the investor to go and look for that capital and now invest it here. Second, they require a lot of expertise and technology and assets. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, why not contract people who could do the job more efficiently? And because of this, the third reason is if a government decides to bear the burden of generating electricity, they end up carrying all the risks of that project, plus money that could be used for other things that directly impact the lives of people like healthcare, education, security, and social services, ends up getting tied into this project. And fourth, these PPAs are a procurement tool. So people will bid to the government to produce electricity in a competitive process. And ideally, what happens with competitive bidding is that the most efficient bidder with affordable rates, without compromising on quality, gets awarded the tender. That way, you and I as a taxpayer and consumer get affordable and reliable power supply. In addition to that, when it comes to generating electricity, you can't rely on just one or two plants to service an entire country. Neither can you just rely on one type of technology like solar or coal or geothermal or hydro. You need to have a mix of power generating sources, because let's say you're just relying on wind. So what happens when it's not windy? And same for solar, in the seasons it's not sunny. So nonetheless, just like many things in Kenya have been abused, the power purchase agreements are no different because they are tenders. So let's look at the issues with the independent power producers in Kenya. The first issue is the number of IPPs and PPAs that we have. However, if how we plan for our power needs is flawed and inaccurate, doesn't that also mean that how we estimate the number of IPPs and the capacity that they carry to generate electricity is also going to be flawed? So where does this abuse come in with these tenders? One of the reasons why electricity is high in Kenya is because there is an oversupply of power, more than what Kenya needs and consumes. And a contributing factor to this is, you guessed it, the number of independent power producers that we have. These IPPs have to be paid regardless of whether KPLC buys power from them. And the reason being, most power purchase agreements operate under a take or pay model or a take and pay model. So under the take and pay model, you pay when you take the power. And under the take or pay model, you pay regardless of whether you take the power. So most PPAs in African countries are under the take or pay model, which is the Kenyan case as well. And the implication for this is that these independent power producers get paid by KPLC for power that we Kenyans do not consume, meaning the IPPs are paid for just being idle and paid to keep their plants running even when we don't use the power. And all the while, more contracts are being negotiated. Which brings me to my next point. Not only do we have more power purchase agreements with IPPs than we need, but they are also very expensive. So KPLC gets 72% of its power from KenGen and 25% of its power from independent power producers. However, 48% of its power costs go to KenGen and 47% of its power costs go to independent power producers, which was coming to about 44 billion in 2020 out of about 84 billion in revenues for KPLC. This means that despite the IPPs contributing to only a third of the power bought by KPLC compared to KenGen, they are paid 3 times more as compared to KenGen. Ideally, the difference between the price at which KenGen sells power to KPLC and the price at which the IPPs sell power to KPLC shouldn't be very different, especially if the technology and the location are the same. So if the power that KPLC buys is expensive, they just pass that cost to you as a consumer, and that's why your power bills are expensive. And that's why the president said this.
In realizing the second tranche of reduction in power bills, I note that the Ministry of Energy and other government departments have initiated engagement with independent power producers aimed at renegotiation of power purchase agreements so as to give our country better value for money for our consumers. I urge the power producers to demonstrate goodwill as we seek to make our energy sector a greater catalyst of our national development.
Now, as I began this video, I highlighted that for the IPPs, it is not a concern as to whether there will be demand for the power that they generate because they don't sell the power to the final consumer, and also because of the take or pay model which their contracts are signed under. So in such cases, you find something called moral hazard, where one party takes on more risks because they know that they won't bear the burden in the event of a bad outcome or a bad decision. A simple example is cars and insurance. If your car doesn't have insurance, you probably won't take it to the road because just in case of an accident, you're the one who will bear all the costs. But if your car is fully insured, you exercise less caution and you even want to try different stunts on the road thinking you're a rally driver. Because you know, in case of an accident, insurance will pay for it. So in the case of IPPs in Kenya, investing a lot of money into putting up a power generation plant is a huge risk, but because they know that they'll be paid and compensated despite the power not being evacuated onto the grid, is a case of moral hazard. Therefore, there is no incentive for the IPPs to be prudent and honest when carrying out their due diligence, if at all they do, because they would know that their projects are feasible but not viable, meaning there's not enough demand and there's an existing oversupply. In short, most independent power producers wouldn't find this market to be profitable if the contracts were under a take and pay model, or if the government didn't bear the financial burden on their behalf, given the current circumstances in the power market. And I assume that's why the power sector in Kenya is so lucrative, because it's borderline fraudulent, and you'll see that as I conclude. Nevertheless, it's important to understand that one thing that contributes to these 3 issues that I've mentioned is that there's a lot of conflict of interest in the power sector. For instance, the scope of the Ministry of Energy is to guide the planning for energy and create policies around that. And the mandate of the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, EPRA, is to regulate the generation and distribution of electricity, among other things related to that. However, the Ministry of Energy and EPRA have been found to be involved in the procurement of services to generate energy and electricity, that's the PPAs, and implementation of power generation, and therefore they're overstepping onto KPLC's mandate. Because you can't set the rules, then be a referee, then also be a player. That's conflict of interest. Eventually, the burden is left to KPLC to deal with because they end up with the contractual obligations in the PPAs to pay these independent power producers. And as you guessed it, the burden is placed on to you and I. On top of that, EPRA is required to review tariffs to make sure we as the citizens aren't overcharged. But from the report, it seems that they are more concerned with protecting the investors of the IPP than us citizens. Lastly, what becomes an additional cost to your electricity bill is the fact that power purchase agreements are denominated either in euros or in dollars. Now, considering that the PPAs are 15 to 20-year contracts, if the Kenya shilling weakens against the dollar or the euro, then you need more money in Kenya shillings to pay these IPPs. And there are many things that could happen which would make the Kenya shilling weaken against the dollar or the euro, especially in a span of 15 to 20 years. For instance, political instability, election years, or importing more than you're exporting as a country, or if your import prices are rising faster than your export prices, or if your government is borrowing too much, or just speculating on political and economic events. All this make the exchange rate fluctuate. So if you look at this graph showing how the Kenya shilling has moved against the dollar since 2012 to 2022, we can say that the Kenya shilling has relatively weakened over time. So each time the Kenya shilling depreciates, your electricity bill becomes more expensive because you as a consumer has to compensate the IPPs for that fluctuation. So in your electricity bill, that appears as a forex charge. So the big question is, can something be done about this? The easy answer is yes. Recommendations have been given, and the logical thing to do is pause all contract negotiations and review and renegotiate the current power purchase agreements. I know that some people in the power sector and in project finance will try to bring in some legalese and technicalities trying to justify why IPPs should be as expensive as they are, etc, etc. But honestly, it's not that complicated. On the other hand, the realistic answer on whether something can be done is maybe. Because one thing is clear, there is lack of integrity and transparency and clear efforts to maintain secrecy on the power purchase contracts in order to frustrate accountability. For instance, what I find mind-boggling and has enabled me to come to the conclusions in this analysis is that how come no one seems to know who the beneficial owners of these independent power producing farms are? It's a question that everyone seems to evade and not give a clear answer. From the president, the former minister of energy, members of parliament, the managing director at KPLC and EPRA. And this is what the former cabinet secretary had to say when he was asked about this.
Yes. Talk to me about where you left it in regards to the independent power producers. Did you at any time whilst CS try to find out who they are, who are the owners of these independent power producers?
Most of the independent power producers are funded by either World Bank, IFC. I mean, if you look at that, there are various companies. It's not an individual. And it's there. They signed a contract with KPLC.
There are those who believe that they are politically connected, that these are politically connected companies, so to speak.
I don't think there is any. It should have come out by now.
So in the 6 years that you were there, you never saw the...
Even if you see...
political machinations or...
I never saw it. Because to get a power purchase agreement, Waiga, it's a process. It's not a 1 year or 2 years. It takes even if you see Lake Turkana, it took almost 10 years for the power plant to be up and running. So it's not something which you can easily get to know.
We get to that. Kimani Ichung'wah has tweeted, "Ask Keter question I asked you, real owners, beneficial owners of the independent power companies selling expensive power to Kenya Power?
Well, the owners are there. These are registered companies in Kenya and abroad. I cannot give them. There are about how many? There are about 10 or so independent power producers in Kenya, and they are there. They are there as a member of parliament. He has that those the Committee on Energy had requested for those information, and they have it.
So you don't want to help?
They have it because the registrar of companies gave them all that. I can't, because I didn't carry. I can't mention all of them, Waiga.
Okay.
Yes.
So he should carry out his work as a parliamentarian.
The registrar of companies, he can carry it.
He wants to know what you...
Which in fact brings me to my next point. The task force in carrying out their assignment had to be creative because KPLC either refused to submit important information that was required to make this analysis, or they submitted it late. The report states, and I quote, "Regarding PPAs specifically, the task force experienced delayed or non-existent provision of critical information from KPLC, causing initial delays in the commencement of the task force's work. While information did eventually trickle in following persistent follow-ups with KPLC's management, and in some instances engaging the KPLC board to push KPLC's management to provide the requested information, in the end there was information that the task force simply did not receive. Such information includes some IPPs audited financial models, tender evaluation reports for thermal plants, and data relating to the monitoring of PPAs, including fuel charges. This lack of cooperation forced the task force to devise workarounds in order to overcome the information deficiency. So it's safe to conclude that it's either a case of defying the president's orders and withholding evidence, or they are incompetent and not maintaining proper records, or it's a case of you and I as a public being managed. Meaning KPLC, the Ministry of Energy, and the politicians all know the owners, but if KPLC submits that information, it will implicate some very prominent people and major financial institutions. Basically, no evidence, no case, and your guess is as good as mine that it's the latter. The commissioning of a task force is a case of public management with no real commitment to fixing the power sector, while you and I as the Kenyan citizens continue to pay for it through very many types of taxes and levies in your electricity bill. In summary, there are individuals who are in the business of generating electricity that we do not need and putting up more power generation plants than is necessary because they are procured and protected by a government that has no regard for the hard work of Kenyans and whose contracts are guaranteed and serviced by the taxes of the ordinary Kenyan. So look out for my next video where I will cover how the issues specific to KPLC contribute to power being expensive in Kenya. So be sure to stick around. I've posted some links in the description box if you'd like to read further and for the sake of reference. If you found this video to be useful, make sure you give it a thumbs up, share, and most importantly, subscribe. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.